Welcome to ALAQA, a podcast about the relationships shaping systems, capital, and the climate transition. Today, I'm joined by Roberta Benedetti del Rio, co-founder and managing partner of Radia Capital, a specialized firm scaling industrial transformation and decarbonisation solutions in Europe. At Radia Capital, Roberta focuses on bridging the funding gap for scale-ups in hard-to-abate sectors like steel, cement, and heavy transport, industries that are both urgent and often overlooked. Her work, from co-chairing the Deep Transitions Lab to shaping climate impact standards, has influenced how investors think about systemic change and measure impact. In this episode, we'll explore how systems thinking reshapes industrial decarbonization and why the future of investing calls for humility, diverse perspectives, and community. Hello, Roberta.
Hello, Iman.
It's such a pleasure to have this conversation with you today. Thank you for making the time.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you.
There are so many things that connect us with this topic of systems and capital. Whenever I started thinking about which guests I would love to have a conversation with on these topics, your name obviously popped up, and for a reason. So if you don't mind, can we start with your story? How professionally you got to get exposed and active and really a pioneer in system change and capital deployment?
Thank you, man. This is so kind. My background has been in investments and sustainability since I started my career. I've always had a passion for really the preservation of the environment. That's my starting point. I grew up in a farm in central Italy, where I am right now, actually. And that's what's always been, I believe, the origin of my motivation, preservation of nature and the environment. Throughout my career, I always strive to move closer to doing that through my work. So spent a large portion of my investing career at Generation Investment Management, one of the pioneering firm in sustainable investing, launched by US Vice President Al Gore and David Blott. And I've learned so much there and really managed to see what it is to be at the forefront of investing for sustainability. Over time, systems change became more and more a topic of sustainable investing. I guess the biggest breakthrough was interacting with the Deep Transitions Lab at the University of Utrecht with Professor Jan Scott, where we really got to thinking about how to theorize systems change for investing, looking at history and sustainability transitions over time. But then again, so many other readings that impacted my thinking over time. And I think the idea is that in investing, there's so much that we can do in terms of having an impact and shaping the economy and the business environment. But sometimes it's very important to keep the big picture of what are we actually doing, how are we shaping this system that we are influencing so much or trying to contribute to influencing. And it's not always so obvious to understand what's the direction of it. And thinking in systems is definitely a really important way to try and integrate that.
It's funny that you mentioned Deep Transitions. Is it a lab or is it a coalition? Is it an organization? Why do you think it's been defining in your understanding of systems as opposed to perhaps being already an active impact investor or sustainability plus investor?
So the Deep Transitions Lab is a collaborative of researchers out of the University of Utrecht. But the interesting thing is that it collaborates with practitioners, so with real-world investors focused on sustainability. The idea is to push the boundaries in investing by taking the pioneers in sustainable investing that really want to have an impact and really want to spend the time to think deeply about systems and move them even further in understanding how to shape systems through investing. So I was lucky enough to collaborate on that and co-chair the group of sustainable investors, which included a wide range of investors from grassroots impact investors in emerging markets to large, huge pension funds, family offices, foundations, and traditional sustainable asset managers. Why was it shaping of my thinking? I think it opened my eyes as to what level of depth in the theories of systems change there are that we aren't necessarily considering as investors or aren't necessarily aware of. And the thing about systems is they're very counterintuitive sometimes in how they change and how they operate and how the parts of a system interact. And so being aware of that is the first step to then help having an intentionality and a definition and over time a tracking of where are we going, what are we contributing to.
Can you give us an example of one thing that you got to unlearn during your time in this collaboration with this group of researchers?
As an investor, I spent a lot of time thinking about impact measurement and reporting, which is something we do ex post. And when we think about that, we go straight into outcomes. outputs, but really outcomes, and then trying to link those to impacts. And those are ideally quantifiable metrics. What I learned and therefore unlearned is that before you go and look at the outcome, actually what's important to look at are the processes. So the processes of transformation of a system. In deep transitions theories, we look at what are called transformative outcomes, which are really just processes of change. How, for example, different niches in a system are formed, how they connect to each other, how they align in scaling in a similar direction, therefore reinforcing each other, how they open up the way that an incumbent system or group of players think or do things. And so it's about processes of change first. And then afterwards, we can also track how the outcomes in the real world change, but that's an output or a result of those processes. And it was quite humbling to unlearn that very direct focus of let's go straight to measuring the outcomes. And actually, there's a step back to take.
And how did you manage to keep a sense of agency? Because anything systems related can be, first, at least to me, very honestly fascinating. It's just like a never ending domain of curiosity and research and endless conversations and thoughts and readings. However, it can also be a bit overwhelming. Donella Meadows has very nice words about the fact that you cannot change a system per se. You dance with it, you try and identify and listen to it. And so how did you manage to keep a sense of agency, as in not releasing the idea that you can decide A and therefore B will happen to that system, but play around it, dance with it, and devise intervention points to come up with hopeful, positive impacts? How did you keep that sense of agency?
It's another really good point. And it was another humbling moment, I would say. But again, it's a very fair representation and a really important learning too. As an investor, we don't directly change a system. And I think that's a very important thing to recognize. As an investor alone, we don't change a system. Or with an intervention alone, we don't change a system. In fact, systems are always changing, irrespective of what we do. We all do things that affect the system one way or the other, but systems are always changing. But we can contribute to it or detract from it, or somehow try and influence a little bit the directionality. So I think it's another humbling recognition, but I find it beautiful because it makes the systems change much more of a collaborative effort and approach. I think it's also quite a good practice to get away from the hubris that sometimes affects us investors as a group, and understand that we are only contributing to a system that is moving anyways. In a similar vein, I learned something else that was equally or similarly humbling, which is you can never effectively direct or choose fully the directionality of what you're trying to achieve. Professor Jan Scott says a sentence very often that I find fascinating. He says, "The future is plural." And again, this is another pitfall that sometimes as investors fall a little bit into, in being very deterministic. We love scenarios and pathways and trends, and like in 2030, this will happen, this will be the cost, this will be the percentage of this fuel or this energy source. We don't know, right? The future is plural, and we're just dancing with it.
I feel it's a source of hope to integrate this idea of plurality. Because in a way, as dire as things seem sometimes, keeping this beautiful idea of possibilities, I think, is a source of hope. So Roberta, on ALAQA, we focus on relationships as levers of change. And I saw that you co-founded a community of practitioners around sustainability and social finance quite some time ago. What can you tell us about how these interactions between individuals in a period where there weren't that many discussions around sustainability and the role of finance as a tool for change at scale? What did this experience teach you about how individuals coming together can come up with the ideas and inner transformations in a way that is not necessarily obvious at the beginning? What can you tell us about this?
This was so long ago, back in probably 2012 or so. I co-founded with a good friend of mine a community of young professionals, mostly in finance or other professional services, interested in impact investing at a time when this wasn't even a big theme. And it was very spontaneous. We organized happy hours with speakers that were doing something interesting in the impact investing sphere, particularly in London, which was where this was emerging at the time. What I learned, first of all, so many more people than I thought or expected really had this drive to have a purpose with their career, with their time, with their brains, with their resources, and wanted to put them at the service of a greater good, and would have loved to have had a job aligned with that. So that was certainly very nice to see. Equally, senior professionals leading large impact investing organizations were equally open and eager to share without any second goal. This was literally just to inspire a community of young people. So that was certainly beautiful. I certainly find so many connections today, which, over 10, 15 years later, of people that come to me and they said, "Oh, I remember you. I came to a Finance Matters happy hour. I'm so grateful. This was so helpful in shaping my career and my views of what I wanted to do." So I guess doing things for just following inspiration and what feels right ultimately serves very well, creates long-lasting relationship and touch points.
You seem to share as if it was something small and obvious for everybody to do and easy, but we all do realize how much work you have to put into maintaining this type of discussions and events. So I'm sure there are many more people who still have an invisible link to you and this group without them even talking about it. But I think that's also the beauty of relationships at large. They don't necessarily have to be visible to matter and to mean something to people. At least that's what I believe over time. What do you think about this?
Absolutely agree. And it's true that looking backwards, it feels easy and a small thing, but it's true. We were working in investment banking, M&A, doing very long hours and meeting at 7 in the morning in a coffee to plan things. And so definitely there was a lot of passion that went into that.
So talking of passion, what you're building today definitely needs passion in a vital force sense, not in an irrational sense. I think it's important to specify it. I think a lot of people know that I'm very active in the field of gender equality and the choice of words. I'm very careful with the choice of words I use when it comes to discussing professional drive, commitments, stamina, when talking to women investors or women professionals at large. And too often the concept of the word of passion is associated with things which seem sometimes vain, sometimes flickering, etc. But really here, the reason why I use this word is that it needs a hell of a bucket of life and inner power to create and kickstart something as ambitious as the project that you're working on and the fund that you're working on today at Radia. Would you like to tell us more in this link of how do we accelerate or contribute to the climate transitions in a way that feels effective, feels timely, that feels inclusive also? And not only to the very lucky, happy few. Can you tell us how you came up with this idea and what you're planning to build with your partners?
So yes, we are building Radia Capital, which is a new investment management firm focused on decarbonizing heavy industries. The focus is on asset-heavy and heavily polluting sectors, which historically have attracted a lot less capital and have been subject to a lot less innovation compared to the softer and asset-light side of the economy, which is usually typically favored by investors, particularly in the early stage. However, these real economy asset-heavy sectors are the ones that contribute to virtually all of the greenhouse gas emissions, because even when they come from software, they still come from energy and a data center and so on. So ultimately, it's the hard things that need to be decarbonized if we want to really make a dent on this tragic situation that we're really going through with climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. So we are focusing on those are hard asset sectors like energy, transportation, industry, building materials. And on top of that, we're also focusing on a stage that is quite neglected, which is the scale-up stage. So we see now quite a few venture capital firms that are funding the initial stages of research and development for technological innovation in these sectors, in these hard tech sectors. And then we see huge amounts of funding going to infrastructure for the rollout of very mature technologies like solar, wind, EV charging, etc. However, in the middle, there is a massive gap. It's a gap of expertise. It's a gap of the right financial structures and solution. It's a gap of really a mix of skills and value creation approach that we are looking to fill with Radia Capital. And this is, I think, the most critical, the most urgent, and the most effective way to really accelerate innovation and accelerate decarbonisation. And I personally think it's also a really interesting commercial opportunity. And the realization of it came simply through my work, seeing pipelines, seeing opportunities, and seeing what was getting funded and what wasn't, and reasons for it that sometimes had nothing to do with the real value of investment opportunities. We're building this with a group of co-founders that I have worked with for a long time, that I deeply trust, that have a strong passion for this topic and have a really strong work ethic and are really exceptional professionals with complementary skill set, either from the investing side, throughout the investing across the capital stack, which is very important for asset heavy sector, having seen sort of the growth equity side, as well as the project finance, lending, structure finance side, because this is something that will be needed by these projects and companies, as well as operating partners that come more from the industry side and the business development side to really help accelerate these companies and these solutions. So the idea even here is connecting to the systems change is the fact of bringing together a pretty diverse set of skills that you don't usually find in an investment firm, both from investing across the capital stack and from the operational side, but with a very deep surgical focus on the industrial sectors, which is all we're going to do.
How do you convey this unique lens that you have developed over time with you and your colleagues? How do you convey this unique lens to your portfolio companies and to the leaders of these portfolio companies when it comes to taking the work that they want to do in their expansion in a way that is aligned with your systems view? How do you convey that?
Usually, I would say they understand immediately what we are about and that our focus is completely on this industrial asset-heavy space. And typically, as they start going through the pitch and it comes to page 2 about the problem, we go, don't worry about that. We know exactly why we need a long-duration energy storage solution or industrial heat solution and how much of the emissions that is and why this is so critical and why this is so hard. So I think they get immediately that we know what we're talking about and we understand the different technologies that are available. We have a very research-driven process, so we tend to hear from a very broad range of companies in a specific solution, and then we tend to weight them, I would say, one against the other in terms of solutions and companies to really understand which ones we believe are the category leader that actually have a potential to change the system at scale. But also we look at it from a broader point of view, from a desirability perspective. So beyond the ability to scale as a business and to win as a business, which is critical because without there's not going to be any impact and there's not going to be any change. But beyond that, we also look at how does this solution overall fits on a system level at large scale. So let's imagine this new long duration energy storage solution, just to make an example, became the gold standard and captured 10% of the market for storage. What would it be at a system level? So that's the greenhouse gas emissions perspective, which is obviously super important and the main driver. But then we look at the use of resources as well, the use of land, the use of materials, mineral waste. We look at the impact on communities, any health impacts. So we have a broader desirability framework where we also rank solutions or assess solutions on the basis of broader criteria to try and bring that into the lens of systems change. You can't just optimize for one factor because you'll end up creating a distortion. I still need to underline that nothing is perfect. Every company, every activity uses resources, has an impact, and it's not going to be perfect. We have to take a pragmatic approach, of course, but also try and improve things as we become owners of these companies to the extent we can, and then just have a discussion and decide what's a red line, what's okay, what can be improved, what has a better alternative, what doesn't, and so on.
When you say, when the founders of these companies start telling us about the problem they're trying to tackle or contribute to be a solution to, you go and say, I see exactly what you mean, don't worry about it, just tell me more about what you're trying to do. What is the nature of the reactions that you have had over time during your fundraising and during your development process of Radia Capital, and perhaps in your previous experiences as well, when it comes to opening this type of discussions with LPs, so with the asset owners? What seems to be obvious in terms of type of problem and time that you invested into researching a topic, researching a problem, and therefore building a set of convictions of what can work, how things should work, how things definitely did not work. Okay, we tried that, so let's forget about it. This is the job of an asset manager and a GP, of course. But how do you transfer this depth of conversations during your discussions with LPs to make it an obvious yes, or to expand the influence that Radia can have beyond just the LPs who are on the cap table today?
Usually in our conversations with LPs, they recognize definitely the need for investing in climate solutions, the need for investing in industrial or hard asset climate solutions. And they are also quite familiar with the funding gap at that middle stage and the need for capital, and therefore the sort of interesting relative position of a funder in that space from a supply and demand of capital standpoint. I think the point that we are still working on explaining, and sometimes is new, let's say, in the conversation, is perhaps that this is an interesting risk-reward proposition from our perspective and not a concessionary proposition. And I think this stems from two different potential misunderstandings that sometimes happen. One is by virtue of the fact that there is a funding gap, this is a relatively new asset class. Therefore, there's a general skepticism or hesitation around backing something that is relatively new in terms of track record of the asset class overall.
And general complexity of the topics that you're dealing with and the nature of the systems that you're trying to influence one way or the other. There's an element of large-scale complexity.
Absolutely. And I think the fact that we are having to put together a team with a very diverse set of skills to tackle that proves that we're doing something more. We're doing more work, for sure. So that's one element. It's just the fact that it's a bit new, it's a bit in between asset classes, and therefore there's a bit of hesitation. The other element is that in the past, some of the investments in these areas not necessarily had the most attractive business characteristics, and therefore have presented a higher risk compared to the reward opportunity that we see. However, we've been in this space, we've seen this, and we specifically focus on certain types of businesses that have attractive risk-reward characteristics from our perspective, and that limit the sort of first-of-a-kind construction risk, very large-scale single sites, operational and build-out risk, commoditization risk, volatility of inputs. So we have a very detailed framework and a very detailed way of approaching the analysis that enables us to identify the leaders, but also the companies with the business models and the potential for platform value creation and a very accurate analysis on the risk mitigation that is very, very different. In fact, has nothing to do with the type of investments that sometimes LPs associate with when we talk about hard assets decarbonization. So this is an area that we spend a lot of time trying to frame.
The discussions with LPs are very much centered on, yes, the investment themes and the sectors and the thesis and the risk returns and the credentials and all that jazz. But fundamentally, it all comes down really to building a common reality through the nurturing of a relationship, of course, a personal relationship and a professional relationship with organizations and individuals within these organizations. And what you're building at Radia and the influx of the systems lens through the decarbonization of hard industries and less obvious and less sexy industries than others would believe, it takes some conviction, honestly, to be able to understand how important, how necessary, and how attractive this type of investment can be for LPs. So how do you entertain and how do you nurture this type of relationships to help them understand and see the reality and the future as you see it as a team?
It definitely takes time and takes a number of interactions. But I think the important thing is to show credibility, to show that we've been doing this for a long time, And just to create the building blocks, hard tech industries haven't been a key focus of the LP community for a very long time. Software has been topping the charts and really gathering all of the attention. But actually, we are in the middle of a huge industrial transformation that will require tens, if not hundreds of trillions in the next 10 years. And whole industries that are at least half of the economy will need to reshape in a way that's more competitive, much more resilient, much more efficient with resources, and ultimately less polluting. This is a necessity not just from a green wish perspective, but also it's an economic and it's a social imperative. I think explaining the drivers that are behind this, that are much more than wanting to decarbonize, it's about building that resilience, building a fair economic system where all of society can thrive, and understanding that there's no other future without that really creates the basis to show that this transformation is only an obvious transition, an obvious evolution of an industrial system that has just been held back for so long by structures and lack of innovation and lack of flow of capitals towards that innovation. But I think in 10, 15 years, we will look back and look at this transition as the most obvious thing that could ever be, because it's obvious from an economic perspective, from a business perspective, and of course, from an environmental and social equity perspective. So yeah, we talk about that, and I think investors see that.
In awe, I'm amazed by honestly every single innovator, thinker, and investor, obviously, who does the work of building the building blocks of what will be the obvious of tomorrow, challenging what common sense is today to make it fit and future fit and compatible with the life of tomorrow and the day after tomorrow is very inspiring. I think you understand by now that I'm the kind of person who tends not to agree with the crowd. And I very much enjoy the concept of being contrarian, thinking against oneself, thinking against what is seen as commonly accepted. So there is a specific section in this discussion which is around contrarian thoughts. So would you like to leave a statement that will be commented by the next guests so that we will be creating a chain and promoting conversations with the audience of one contrarian thought, a hot take, something that usually is seen by the people you interact with as, oh, surprising, a bit tickling, or clearly contrarian against the tide. What would be your one contrarian thought, Roberta?
The thing that comes to mind, but I don't want to be too self-promotional, but I think we can create more economic value with investments in old and unsexy industries today than in software tech.
And why do you think it's not something that is already considered as a totally acceptable and attractive? Why do you think it's contrarian?
I think most investors still prefer the software and the asset light investment side. I think there's a perception that there's more risk on the hard tech side on the back of complexity of execution and operational execution. However, I think there's a much higher potential to create barriers to entry as well, while on the software side, that was the case in the past decades, but that barrier to entry, that moat has been eroding, and I think the proliferation of AI is contributing to that erosion. The other factor from my point of view is the supply and demand of capital that creates an imbalance in valuation. But ultimately, yeah, I still think that is not seen as the status quo for most investors. And in fact, most funds, even many climate-themed funds still spend quite a lot of their time and assets on asset light or software side of businesses.
Next question. Your go-to person. Since we're talking about relationships in systems, it would be nice to have a shout-out moment. So who would be your go-to person when thinking about contributing to not changing the system, because we clearly understood that it's not how these things work, but influencing or dancing together with the system? Who would be your go-to person?
I'm going to say David Blood, the CEO of Generation. He has been a sort of a mentor to me, and he's been incredibly valuable in encouraging me to take the decision to launch Radia Capital with my colleagues. And he believed in me straight from the beginning when this was just an idea, and supported us. So it's an incredible example of collaboration, of encouraging the next generation, and of just unwavering alignment with the mission and with doing the right thing in spite of everything else.
So time for our flash round. Big questions, short answers. 1. A question you wish more investors would ask, or a question you wish you would have asked earlier in your career?
So one question I wish more investors ask themselves is, how can I make a difference? And as an emerging manager, that is about supporting us early in the journey.
The system you'd love to see more expansion or more disruption in?
All of them: energy, materials, plastics, concrete, steel, chemicals, foods.
Biosphere in general. Okay, and everything that is in it. And my final question, what gives you hope in the climate space right now?
The resilience and the persistence of investors that are in this world, despite the macro and the geopolitical. I see continued persistence and no shaking of that.
Thank you, Roberta. And thank you all for listening to ALAQA. And if this conversation sparked something for you, share it, leave a review, and subscribe for more dialogues at the intersection of capital, systems, and transformation.